April 1943, the Atlantic Ocean. A German U-boat officer stands on the deck of a U.S. Navy destroyer, hands bound, salt crusting his lips. His submarine lies somewhere beneath the waves now, torn open by depth charges. Around him, American sailors move with practiced efficiency, calm, fed, clean-shaven. He watches them. No desperation in their eyes, no hunger in their faces. He had been told America was soft, that their industry was exaggerated propaganda, that the Reich's engineers were unmatched. But as the destroyer cuts through the water, he sees something that unsettles him more than the defeat itself. The ship is new, freshly painted. The equipment gleams. The crew eats hot meals from steel trays, not scraps from tins. This is not the America he was promised. In the months to come, over 400,000 German soldiers, sailors, and airmen will cross the Atlantic Ocean as prisoners of war. They will arrive expecting deprivation, chaos, maybe revenge. Instead, they will witness something that will shatter every assumption drilled into them by years of propaganda. The staggering, incomprehensible scale of American industrial power. And for many, that shock will be more disorienting than capture itself. By early 1943, the tide of World War II had not yet fully turned, but cracks were forming in the Axis war machine. Germany was locked in brutal attrition on the Eastern Front, bleeding men and material into the steppes of Russia. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps was collapsing under the weight of British and American offensives. The U-boat war in the Atlantic, once Germany's stranglehold on Allied supply lines, was faltering as convoys grew stronger and Allied air cover extended farther into the ocean. For the first time, large numbers of German military personnel were being taken prisoner, not in the dozens, but in the thousands. Entire units surrendered in Tunisia. U-boat crews were plucked from the sea after their vessels were sunk. Luftwaffe pilots parachuted into Allied hands over the Mediterranean. These men had been conditioned to believe in German superiority. They had marched through Europe behind the swastika. They had seen Warsaw burn, Paris fall, and the Soviet Union reel backward. Victory, they were told, was inevitable. But now they were prisoners, and their destination was not a camp in England or a holding pen in North Africa. They were being shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. The decision to house German POWs in America was not born of charity. It was logistics. Britain, already overcrowded and under constant threat of bombing, lacked the space and resources to handle hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Soviet Union, fighting for survival, had no interest in observing Geneva Convention niceties. The United States, distant from the fighting and vast in geography, became the natural choice. Between 1943 and 1945, over 400,000 German prisoners would be transported to more than 500 camps scattered across the American interior, from Texas to Wisconsin, from California to Georgia. Most of these men had never set foot outside Europe. Their understanding of America was shaped entirely by Nazi propaganda, which painted the United States as a decadent, disorganized society on the brink of collapse. They were told American soldiers were cowards, that the economy was controlled by Jews, that racial tensions would tear the country apart before it could mount a serious war effort. They were told American tanks were tin, American planes were fragile, and American factories were propaganda inventions, numbers inflated to intimidate the Reich. The propaganda was meticulous. Films showed breadlines from the Great Depression. Radio broadcasts mocked American culture as shallow and materialistic. Nazi officials pointed to the Dust Bowl, to labor strikes, to economic inequality, and declared that the United States was a paper tiger, powerful on paper, weak in reality. German soldiers absorbed this narrative. They believed it. Why wouldn't they? It came from their leaders, their teachers, their newspapers. It was repeated until it became truth. So when these prisoners boarded transport ships in Casablanca, in Naples, in captured French ports, they expected to arrive in a weakened nation. They expected overcrowded camps, scarce food, aging infrastructure. They expected to see the cracks. Instead, they saw the opposite. The voyage itself was jarring. Many prisoners later recalled the shock of the food aboard American troop transports: white bread, canned fruit, coffee with sugar. For men who had been rationed for years, who had eaten sawdust-mixed bread and watery soup, this abundance was incomprehensible. Some thought it was a trick, a final meal before execution. Others ate cautiously, waiting for the scarcity to return. It didn't. When the ships docked, often in New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans, the prisoners stepped onto American soil and into a world that did not match the script. The ports were not bombed-out ruins. They were bustling, modern, alive with activity. Cranes lifted cargo with mechanical precision. Trucks moved in endless convoys. Ships, brand-new Liberty ships, welded together in a matter of weeks, lined the docks by the dozens. And the people. The dock workers, the soldiers, the civilians moving through the streets beyond the fences. They looked healthy, well-fed, unhurried. This was not a nation on the brink. This was a nation in full stride.
The train journeys into the interior deepened the dissonance. Prisoners were loaded onto rail cars, often passenger cars, not cattle wagons, and transported across the continent. The distances alone were staggering. A German soldier from Bavaria might travel for 3 days straight, watching the landscape scroll past the windows, cities that stretched for miles, farms with machinery that dwarfed anything in Europe, factories so large they looked like entire towns. They saw steel mills in Pennsylvania belching smoke into the sky, refineries in Texas sprawling across the horizon, aircraft plants in California where rows of bombers sat gleaming on the tarmac like a vision from a dream. They saw highways thick with traffic, power lines strung across endless plains, grain silos that towered like cathedrals. And everywhere, there was newness, fresh paint, modern design, the sense that nothing was old, nothing was worn, nothing was running on fumes. One prisoner, a Wehrmacht sergeant captured in Tunisia, later wrote in his diary, "We passed through a city, I don't remember the name, and I counted the cars on the road. I stopped counting after 200. In Germany, only officers and officials have cars. Here, even workers drive." Another, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Sicily, recalled staring out the window at a Midwestern farm. The farmer had 3 tractors. 3. I thought, how can one man need 3 tractors? Then I realized, he doesn't need them. He simply has them. This was the first crack in the narrative. Germany had mobilized every resource, every factory, every worker toward total war. The economy was lean, efficient, stripped down to essentials. There was no waste, no excess. And yet, here was a nation that seemed to produce abundance as a byproduct. America wasn't just fighting a war. It was fighting a war while maintaining a standard of living that Germany had never known even in peacetime. The camps themselves reinforced this. Most POW camps in the United States were hastily constructed, but functional. Rows of barracks, mess halls, recreation areas, medical facilities. Prisoners were given 3 meals a day, often with portions that exceeded what German soldiers had received at the front. They were issued clothing, bedding, toiletries. They had access to libraries, sports equipment, even musical instruments. The Geneva Convention was followed, often to the letter. For many, this was incomprehensible. They had been told that Americans were weak, that they couldn't stomach hardship, that they would collapse under the strain of war. And yet, here they were, treating enemy soldiers better than the Wehrmacht had treated its own men in the final years of the war. It wasn't cruelty that shocked the prisoners. It was generosity. It was the casual, almost careless abundance. Some tried to rationalize it. This must be propaganda, they thought, a show camp designed to impress. But as weeks turned into months, as they were put to work on farms, in forests, in factories, the illusion crumbled. They saw the same abundance everywhere. The farmer who employed them for harvest had a truck, a telephone, a radio. The small-town sheriff who checked on the work detail drove a new car. The factory where they assembled parts had lighting, ventilation, and safety equipment that German factories lacked. And slowly, the realization set in. This wasn't propaganda. This was normal. This was just how America worked. The psychological impact was profound. These were men who had been raised to believe in German exceptionalism, in the superiority of Aryan discipline and engineering. They had been told that the Reich was the pinnacle of civilization, that Germany's destiny was to lead Europe into a new order. And now, standing in a prisoner of war camp in the middle of Kansas, watching trucks deliver fresh bread and milk every morning, they were confronted with a different reality. America hadn't just matched Germany's industrial output, it had buried it, without breaking a sweat.
German engineering had a reputation, and in many ways it was deserved. The Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, these were marvels of innovation, bleeding-edge technology that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But they were also complex, expensive, and difficult to produce in large numbers. A single Tiger tank required thousands of man-hours to build. Each V-2 was a handcrafted miracle of precision machining. American equipment, by contrast, was often simpler. The Sherman tank was no Tiger. The P-51 Mustang was no Me-262. But they were reliable, easy to repair, and most importantly, mass-produced on a scale that defied comprehension. For every Tiger, there were 10 Shermans. For every Me-262, 100 Mustangs. German POWs who worked in American factories saw this firsthand. They watched assembly lines where workers, many of them women, turned out aircraft parts, engine blocks, ammunition casings with mechanical rhythm. The work was repetitive, almost boring, but the output was astronomical. One prisoner, an engineer, estimated that a single Ford plant in Michigan produced more vehicles in a week than all of Germany's auto manufacturers combined in a month. It wasn't that their machines were better, it's that they had so many of them, and they never stopped. Many POWs were assigned to work on American farms, especially in the South and Midwest, where labor shortages were acute. For rural German soldiers, this should have been familiar territory. Instead, it was another revelation. German agriculture, even before the war, was a mix of small family farms and large estates, much of it still reliant on horse-drawn equipment and manual labor. Mechanization existed, but it was limited. Tractors were expensive, fuel was rationed, horses were practical. In America, even small farms were mechanized. Prisoners watched farmers plowing fields with tractors that moved faster than a marching column. They saw combines that could harvest in a day what would take a dozen men a week. They saw irrigation systems, grain elevators, refrigerated trucks that transported produce across states. One prisoner, working a tobacco farm in North Carolina, wrote home, "The farmer here complains about labor costs. I want to laugh. He has more machines than our entire village."
It wasn't just the machinery, it was the food. Even with wartime rationing, American farms produced such an excess that prisoners working the fields were often allowed to take home vegetables, fruit, sometimes even meat. They ate better as prisoners in rural Texas than they had as soldiers in occupied France. One of the most disorienting aspects of American life, as seen through the eyes of German POWs, was that the civilian economy hadn't collapsed. In Germany, total war meant total mobilization. Civilian production was stripped to essentials. Luxuries vanished. Clothes were patched. Shoes were resold until they fell apart. Entertainment with state-controlled propaganda. Every resource was funneled toward the war effort, and the population bore the burden with grim determination. In America, rationing existed, gas, rubber, sugar, meat, but life continued with shocking normalcy. Prisoners working near town saw movie theaters open, restaurants serving meals, shops selling goods. They saw civilians driving cars for leisure, not just necessity. They saw baseball games, county fairs, church socials. The war was present, posters, bond drives, patriotic speeches, but it wasn't suffocating. One prisoner in a camp near St. Louis recalled being taken to a Red Cross event where civilian volunteers handed out cigarettes, books, and care packages. He asked the translator if these people were rich. He laughed and said, "No, they're just volunteers." I didn't understand. Why would ordinary people give things to enemy prisoners? In Germany, civilians barely had enough for themselves. This generosity wasn't universal. There were instances of hostility, especially in areas with strong anti-German sentiment, but it was common enough to leave an impression. America seemed to have enough. Enough food, enough goods, enough energy to fight a two-front war and still maintain a functioning society.
The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years preparing German soldiers for total war. They were told that sacrifice was noble, that hardship was temporary, that victory was close. They were told the enemy was weak, divided, morally bankrupt. They were told America was on the verge of collapse, that one more push would break them. But standing in a POW camp in Arizona, eating roast chicken and potatoes, reading newspapers in the camp library, watching American soldiers play softball in their free time, the propaganda became impossible to sustain. Some prisoners clung to it, Nazis, true believers, officers who refused to accept defeat. They insisted the camps were staged, that the abundance was fake, that Germany would still win. But others let it go. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly. As the evidence piled up, the certainty crumbled. One former Wehrmacht corporal later said, "I realized the war was lost the moment I saw an American warehouse full of spare parts. Just spare parts. Engines, wheels, batteries, tools, piled to the ceiling. We had been told Germany's factories were superior, but I had never seen a German warehouse like that. We didn't have spare parts. We had shortages." Not all prisoners responded with shock or admiration. For some, the abundance was deeply unsettling in a different way. If America had this much food, this much steel, this much energy, why hadn't it entered the war sooner? Why had it let Europe burn for 2 years before committing its power? This question didn't have an easy answer. Some prisoners wrestled with bitterness. Others found a kind of grim respect. But almost all agreed on one thing. If America had joined the war in 1939, it would have been over in 1941. The industrial gap was that vast.
The moment of full realization didn't come at once. It came in waves.
in small revelations that accumulated over time. But for many prisoners, there was a specific breaking point, a single experience that crystallized everything they had seen and forced them to confront the truth. For some, it was the day they were taken to work at an American factory. Camp Bittner, North Carolina, housed several thousand German POWs, many of whom were assigned to local industries suffering labor shortages. One group was sent to a textile mill, another to a furniture factory, a third to an aircraft parts plant. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, again a composite based on real accounts, was among those sent to the aircraft plant. He had been a logistics officer in the Luftwaffe, responsible for managing supply chains and production schedules for a fighter wing in France. He knew the German aviation industry intimately. He knew how many man-hours went into building a Messerschmitt. He knew how many were produced each month. He knew the bottlenecks, the shortages, the constant scramble for aluminum, rubber, ball bearings. When he walked into the American plant, he stopped moving. The building was the size of several city blocks, a cathedral of steel and glass. The noise was overwhelming. Machines stamping, welding, drilling, riveting, all in a synchronized rhythm. Overhead cranes moved parts from station to station. Workers in clean overalls assembled components with practiced ease. And the parts? There were thousands of them, arranged in neat rows, each labeled, each tracked, each moving through the system with mechanical precision. Hartmann stood there, watching, and felt his chest tighten. This wasn't a factory. This was a machine from making machines. And it never stopped. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with a clipboard, told him through a translator that this plant produced parts for B-17 bombers, tail assemblies, wing sections, landing gear. Thousands of pieces every month, all shipped to final assembly plants where the bombers were put together in a matter of days. "How many bombers does America build in a month?" asked Hartmann. The supervisor shrugged. "I don't know the exact number. A few thousand, I think." Hartmann nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for clarification. He just nodded. Because in that moment, he understood. Germany, at its peak, had produced maybe 300 aircraft a month. Maybe. And that's with every factory running flat out, every worker pushed to exhaustion, every resource scraped together. America was producing 10 times that, maybe 20 times. And they were doing it while also building tanks, ships, trucks, jeeps, artillery, ammunition, and everything else a modern military needed. We never had a chance. We never even came close. The psychological weight of this realization was crushing for some. These were men who had believed in victory, who had fought for years under the assumption that Germany's superior training, tactics, and technology would prevail. They had seen the Blitzkrieg roll across Europe. They had stood in occupied Paris, in Warsaw, in Athens, and believed they were invincible. Now they stood in a POW camp in the middle of nowhere, watching American supply trucks roll in with absurd regularity, and realized they had been lied to, not just by propaganda, but by their own perceptions. They had underestimated the enemy so completely that defeat had been inevitable from the start. Some sank into depression. Others became cynical, bitter toward the Nazi leadership that had led them into this catastrophe. A few clung to denial, insisting that secret weapons, the V-2, the jet fighter, the wonder technologies would still turn the tide. But most, slowly, accepted reality. The reports that filtered back from the front only reinforced this. By late 1944, prisoners were receiving letters from home, censored but still informative. They heard about the Allied bombing campaigns, about cities reduced to rubble, about factories destroyed. They heard about the Red Army's advance from the east, about the collapse in France, about the shrinking borders of the Reich. And they compared it to their own lives. 3 meals a day, warm barracks, medical care, even wages for their labor. One prisoner in Camp Concordia, Kansas, wrote in a letter home, "We are safe here. The Americans treat us well, better than we deserve. I do not know what will happen when the war ends, but I know we are better off here than you are there. I am sorry to say this, but it is the truth." The climax wasn't a single event. It was the slow, grinding erosion of belief, the realization that the war was not only lost, but had been lost from the beginning. The turning point was the moment each man, individually, let go of the illusion and accepted the scale of the mistake. For Hartman, it was standing in that aircraft plant. For Muller, it was the day he saw a supply convoy stretching so far down the road he couldn't see the end. For others, it was smaller. A conversation with a guard, a newspaper article, a glimpse of a map showing the Allied advance. But for all of them, the moment came. And once it did, there was no going back. Some embraced it. They began learning English. They cooperated with camp authorities. They attended education programs, some even taking courses in democracy and American civics, programs designed to denazify prisoners and prepare them for a post-war world. They accepted that the Germany that they had known was gone, and something new would have to take its place. Others resisted. Hardcore Nazis within the camps enforced loyalty, sometimes violently. There were incidents of prisoners being beaten, even killed for expressing doubts about the Führer or showing friendliness toward Americans. Camp authorities struggled to separate the fanatics from the moderates, creating segregated compounds for die-hard Nazis to prevent them from intimidating others. But even among the resistors, doubt crept in, because no matter how tightly they clung to ideology, they couldn't unsee what they had seen. They couldn't unhear the stories from the front. They couldn't ignore the abundance, the machinery, the sheer crushing weight of American industrial power.
By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, most German POWs in America had already accepted the outcome. They listened to the news of Hitler's death, of Germany's surrender, with quiet resignation. Some wept, others felt relief. A few felt nothing at all, numb from years of disillusionment. But almost all of them understood, on some level, that the world they had fought for was gone, and America, this vast, industrial, incomprehensible nation, had been the force that destroyed it.
The war's end did not mean immediate freedom. German POWs remained in American camps for months, sometimes over a year, as the Allies grappled with the logistics of repatriation. Europe was in ruins. Transportation networks were destroyed. Food and housing were scarce. Sending hundreds of thousands of prisoners back into that chaos was impractical, even dangerous. So, they stayed. For many, this extended captivity was a strange limbo. They were no longer soldiers. The war was over, but they were not yet free. They continued working on farms, in forests, in factories, earning small wages, sending money home when they could. They read newspapers, listened to radios, and learned the full extent of the devastation. They learned about the concentration camps, about the Holocaust, about the crimes committed in Germany's name. Some refused to believe it. Others were horrified. A few had suspected, but hadn't known the scale. The denazification programs intensified. Prisoners attended screenings of films documenting the liberation of Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. They were shown photographs, testimonies, evidence. Reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners wept, ashamed and broken. Others sat stone-faced, refusing to accept it. A few shouted that it was Allied propaganda, that the images were faked. But as more evidence piled up, even the skeptics found it harder to deny. One prisoner later wrote, "I had fought for Germany. I had believed we were defending our homeland, our way of life. But when I saw those films, I realized I had fought for monsters. I didn't know, but not knowing doesn't change what happened." The psychological toll was immense. Many prisoners struggled with guilt, not necessarily for their own actions, but for the collective guilt of a nation. They had worn the uniform. They had served the regime. Even if they had never set foot in a concentration camp, even if they had only fought on the battlefield, they were part of the machine that made the Holocaust possible. Some internalized this guilt deeply. Others compartmentalized, separating their own service from the crimes of the SS and the regime. But the question lingered: what does it mean to have fought for the wrong side? Meanwhile, life in the camps continued. By 1946, many prisoners had been in America for over 2 years. Some had formed friendships with guards, with local farmers, even with civilians in nearby towns. They had adapted to American life, watching baseball, listening to jazz, eating hamburgers, learning slang. For some, the prospect of returning to a destroyed Germany was terrifying. They had become, in a strange way, comfortable.
Repatriation began in earnest in 1946. Prisoners were transported back to Europe in waves, often through France or Britain, then onward to occupied Germany. The journey was long, uncertain, and filled with dread. Many didn't know what they were returning to. Their cities had been bombed. Their families might be dead or displaced. The Germany they had known was gone, divided into occupation zones, ruled by foreign powers. When they arrived, the contrast was stark. The abundance of America, the relative comfort of the camps, gave way to hunger, rubble, and despair. Berlin was a wasteland. Hamburg was flattened. Munich was scarred. The infrastructure that had once been the pride of the Reich, the roads, the railways, the factories, was shattered. Food was scarce. Housing was scarce. Work was scarce. The German economy, once a juggernaut, was on its knees. Many former POWs struggled to reintegrate. They had seen a different world, a world where industry worked, where resources weren't rationed to starvation levels, where civilians lived normal lives. Coming back to the ruins of Germany felt like stepping backward in time. Some fell into depression. Others threw themselves into reconstruction, determined to rebuild what had been lost. A few, unable to cope, took their own lives. But there was another effect, quieter but profound. The former prisoners became ambassadors of a sort. They told their families, their neighbors, their communities about what they had seen. They described the factories, the farms, the abundance. They described the treatment they had received, fair, humane, even generous. And they described the realization that had come to them in those camps. Germany had been wrong, not just strategically, but morally. The war had been a catastrophe, the Nazi regime a lie, and the promise of a 1,000-year Reich a delusion. This wasn't a popular message in the immediate post-war years. Many Germans were focused on survival, not reflection. But as the years passed, as the Marshall Plan poured aid into West Germany, as Reconstruction began in earnest, the stories of the POWs became part of the national reckoning. They contributed to the slow, painful process of coming to terms with the past. Some former prisoners emigrated, returning to the United States legally in the 1950s and 60s. They had seen a future there, a way of life that Germany, at least in those years, couldn't offer. They became farmers, engineers, businessmen. They married, had children, built lives, and when asked about their experience, many said the same thing. America showed me what was possible. I didn't want to live in the past anymore. In Germany, the legacy of these men was more complicated. They were not heroes. They were not victims. They were survivors of a war their nation had started and lost, and they carried that weight differently. But their testimony about American industry, about the gap in power, about the folly of the Nazi regime, became part of the historical record. It reinforced the lesson that would shape West Germany's post-war identity: never again. The camps themselves were dismantled. By 1948, nearly all the POW facilities in the United States had been closed, the barracks torn down or repurposed. The land returned to farmland, to forests, to towns. A few markers remain: historical plaques, memorials, the occasional preserved building. But for the most part, the camps faded into history, a footnote in the larger story of World War II. Yet the impact lingered. The 400,000 German prisoners who passed through America didn't just return home with stories. They returned with a new understanding of the world, of power, of what industrial might could achieve. And many of them never forgot the first time they stepped off a train in the middle of Kansas and realized that everything they had been told was a lie. There is a photograph, black and white and slightly faded, that captures something essential about this story. It shows a group of German POWs working on a farm somewhere in Oklahoma, 1944. They are gathered around a tractor, an international harvester, sturdy and new, while an American farmer explains something, gesturing at the engine. The prisoners are listening, some curious, some skeptical. In the background, rows of wheat stretch to the horizon. The photograph is unremarkable. It could be from any of 1,000 similar moments during those years. But it represents something larger: the collision of two worlds, two ideologies, two visions of what power meant. On one side, the belief that discipline, sacrifice, and racial purity would forge an empire. On the other, the quiet confidence of a nation that simply built more, made more, produced more than anyone thought possible. The prisoners in that photograph returned to Germany. The tractor stayed in Oklahoma, working the fields for decades. The wheat grew, was harvested, and fed millions. And the lesson, simple, brutal, and undeniable, remained. Wars are won not just by courage or tactics, but by the factories, the farms, the infrastructure that support the fight. Germany had courage, it had tactics, it had brilliant generals and brave soldiers. But America had factories that never stopped, farms that never ran dry, and an economy so vast it could fight a global war without collapsing into deprivation. The German POWs who witnessed this firsthand carried that knowledge back with them. Some became voices for peace, for reconstruction, for reconciliation. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to speak of the years they spent as prisoners. But all of them, in some way, were changed by what they saw. They had crossed the Atlantic expecting cruelty or chaos. Instead, they found a different kind of power, one that didn't shout, didn't boast, but simply worked, relentlessly, efficiently, unstoppably. In the end, the shock they felt wasn't just about machines or production numbers. It was about the collapse of certainty, the realization that the world they thought they knew was built on lies. And in the ruins of that realization, a new understanding began to take shape, one that would, in time, help rebuild a shattered nation and reshape the course of history. The war ended, the prisoners went home. But the memory of America's industrial might, seen through the eyes of those who had been its enemies, endured. A reminder that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's just the quiet hum of a factory, running through the night, long after the battle has ended.
Thanks for watching, Patriots. If you're proud to be an American, smash that like button, share this video, and ring the bell. Don't forget to subscribe to Arsenal of Democracy, your home for true American power and history. And tell me in the comments what epic story you want to see next.